let's go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Reed. I'm a board member with the Preservation Association of Lincoln. We are a local preservation nonprofit advocating for historic preservation and also educating people on what historic preservation is. And that's why we're excited to have Brian here today to talk about his dissertation, looking at the fairly recent history of the historic preservation movement in the 1960s and 70s. Because the preservation movement's been around for about 2 centuries in the United States, and from its beginning, it's really evolved over time, and it's going to keep changing as time goes on. For example, Anne Pamela Cunningham, in the 1850s, she was really influential in saving Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, the first president of the United States, as we should all know. And for over a century, the focus of interpretation was on George Washington, his time as general, his time as president, having that tangible piece of his history, Mount Vernon, that we could all go there and see. Well, in the last 10 years, the focus of interpretation started to change because it wasn't just George Washington living there and Martha Washington living there. There was also 300 enslaved individuals who made Mount Vernon what it was and gave George Washington his wealth and his status in early America. So the interpretation of that place has evolved over time to show, there were other individuals living there, not by choice, who were working there. And, in some of the primary resources we have, we know who these people were. And that's just a small tidbit on how the preservation movement has really changed over the years. And like I said, will continue to change. And that's why we're excited to have Brian here today to talk about his dissertation for this webinar called To Maintain the Status Quo, Historic Preservation, White Flight, and the Urban Crisis. A little bit about Brian. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, whose research focuses on the intersection between historic preservation, real estate, and the urban crisis of the 1960s and 1970s. His dissertation project examines preservation organizations in Springfield, Massachusetts, and throughout the state of Massachusetts to explore how preservationists prioritize private property ownership as a strategy to respond to perceived rises in urban crime, white flight, the 20th century Black freedom struggle, and the urban rental housing crisis. Brian also holds a certificate in public history with a concentration in historic preservation. A native of Omaha, Nebraska, Brian graduated with a BA in history from Hastings College in Hastings, Nebraska in 2018. While a student at Hastings College, Brian wrote and successfully nominated the Hastings College Historic District to the National Register of Historic Preservation of Historic Places, excuse me. We're going to get started, and if you have any questions, I ask that you please save them until the end and type them in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to read those for you at the end. So without further ado, we're going to let Brian start, and thank you very much, Brian, for being here, and thank you everybody for attending today.
Thank you, Ryan. And I want to thank the Preservation Association of Lincoln for having me here to give this webinar. I'm super excited to share some of the stuff that I've been learning about and writing about and thinking about for the last couple of years in my time here at UMass. And I'm also looking forward to how this conversation will hopefully generate lots of dialogue and discussion. I don't want to talk at you all for a long extended period of time. I really hope that I can sort of present some of the things that I've been stewing on, and then we can kind of go from there with thinking through what are the implications of some of these things and what do they mean and how can we think about ways to make the preservation movement more inclusive and equitable and thinking through things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with just a brief little PowerPoint. So as Ryan said, I'm a PhD candidate at UMass here, and my dissertation is looking at Springfield, Massachusetts, which if you don't know where that is, I would not blame you all if you're phoning in from Nebraska. It's in the central Connecticut Valley here in Western Massachusetts. But I'm really concerned with a lot of what's going on in the preservation movement sort of across the board in all places in the United States following what the landmark 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, which we all know and somewhat begrudgingly love, which we see as this great pinnacle of the end of the preservation movement, this great victory of the preservation movement in the 60s. And my interest lies in what happens after 1966. And in American cities in particular, there's a lot of different things going on. In particular, what's happening is something historians and commentators at the time refer to as the urban crisis, which I'll sort of get into what that is in a little bit. But I'm really curious about how preservationists are responding to this crisis and the ways in which they are trying to make their movement politically useful to address this crisis, which is sort of ongoing in cities in the late 60s and early 70s. So as I move through this, I'll try to tie some of this back to a few things going on in Nebraska as much as possible, since I assume that's where a lot of folks are coming in from. But I'll also be kind of jumping in and out of different scales. I'll be looking at things on the ground in Springfield and sometimes zooming out to think about what's happening at a more national level. So we'll be kind of going through a lot of different spaces very quickly here. So first, I'll just sort of briefly outline, like, what do I mean when I say the urban crisis? Like, what is this thing that's going on in cities? What is white flight and its relationship to the urban crisis? And then finally, how is preservation like tied up into all of this stuff? So the urban crisis is a term that historians have used to describe a series of events that took place in US cities in the 1960s and 70s. In particular, it's remembered most prominently as the series of so-called riots or uprisings that occurred in cities, particularly segregated Black urban communities in the late 1960s, where Black folks lead uprisings, often triggered by specific acts of police violence for greater resources that have been withheld from them. So during this period, of course, between 1964 and 72 alone, around 960 segregated Black communities in cities across the US witnessed over 1,000 separate uprisings, many of which were sparked by police violence. So of course, in Nebraska, in Omaha, there were 3 separate uprisings in 66, 68, and 69. And that 69 uprising is what is the photo in the background here. But these uprisings weren't contained to this period. The majority of them happened at this time. But some occur as late as 1975. Like there's one in Springfield that happens in the city's north end. We witnessed a series of uprisings 2 summers ago, right? Like this is a sort of ongoing trend in urban history and urban life. And this is how the urban crisis is sort of remembered, but I want to have you all picture a very thick strand of rope where there's all different kinds of things being woven in to make the rope. And these uprisings are just one sort of thread in that particular rope, kind of binding the crisis together. The other sort of major component here is white flight. There's also the displacement of urban renewal. There's the flight and closure of factories that try to seek greener pastures outside of the United States. All of these things are sort of constituting the urban crisis. It's not just these uprisings, which are more or less a symptom of this broader crisis that's going on. So white flight is one of the other most prominent elements of this crisis. So white flight is known sort of as the movement of affluent middle-class white folks out of inner city neighborhoods and into segregated and exclusive suburbs, either that are completely autonomous suburbs, they don't belong to a city government, they have their own governmental system, or perhaps they're sort of on the fringes of cities. And there's an entire post-war housing market and lending and financing industry that sort of exclusively builds these new homes and extends loans and mortgages to white folks, while denying those same things to Black folks who are sort of contained within the inner city. They're not able to get mortgages, they're not able to get loans. It's this very structural barrier to accessing suburban homeownership. And the suburbs are sustained by these very exclusionary zoning policies that stipulate that houses have to be single family and that the taxes have to be at a certain rate. And these policies are, in theory, race neutral, but they're predicated on this kind of racial exclusion that assumed that non-white or Black people would be a threat to property values, and that in order to keep property values stable, those people had to be excluded from the suburbs. And this language of zoning provides this very, very useful framework where this mobile, more affluent and fast growing white middle class could explain their desire for these kinds of exclusion without invoking the ideologically loaded language of race. So this is what we could also imagine as like a coded language, like we move to the suburbs because the schools are good and because the home values are stable, right? Like it's these sort of unspoken, sort of tacit wink, wink, nudge, nudge things going on. And so what we begin to see over time is the total flight of white folks from the city. So if we pull in Omaha as an example here again, this is Omaha's white and Black population in 1950. You can see for most of Douglas County, there's not even enough data to like fully know how many white folks or Black folks are living there. We can see what is sort of the North 24th Street corridor where it's primarily Black folks. And then just 2 decades later, we have this explosion of the white population in the surrounding suburbs, in the rest of the county. So this is the growth of places like Millard and Bennington and Elkhorn. And this movement of white people out of the city causes a lot of really severe anxieties in city policymakers in particular, who are worried about how they're going to maintain the tax base with people leaving the city. And in places like Omaha and Nebraska and the Sun Belt and the West that have these huge expanses of land that no one is particularly living in until white folks start leaving, they have the option to annex those towns, which we see in Omaha's annexation of Millard, Omaha's annexation of Elkhorn. They're able to sort of chase white people as they leave by there's this game of leapfrog where white folks leave and the city boundaries follow. But places in the Northeast don't have that option. So this is the state of Massachusetts with Springfield highlighted. As you can see, there's no unincorporated land in the entire state of Massachusetts. All of the towns fit together like this really complex jigsaw puzzle. And these boundaries have remained relatively fixed since the 19th century. So places like Springfield can't just like annex the town next door to them, or if they try to, it'll be a really severe uphill battle. So these places had to look for other options in terms of maintaining that tax base and maintaining that tax revenue. Now, this is the way that this story is traditionally told. White folks leave the city after they witness the sort of violence of these urban uprisings. They take their tax dollars with them. Cities start to annex. This is a pretty typical story some of you have probably already heard. And I'm not particularly interested in like hashing that out. I'm more interested in thinking about what happened to those white folks who stayed behind, who did not leave the city, who decided that they could try and maintain the tax base and try and maintain certain kinds of exclusion and boundaries within city limits, not outside of them. So the white folks that stay behind in places like Springfield, and here's a map of Springfield just to give you a better sense, they accrue new political power because they can leverage the fact that they're upstanding middle-class taxpayers, and point to themselves and say to city officials, we're not leaving, we're not moving to surrounding towns, we're staying and keeping our tax dollars here. So you need to make sure that we have the things we want in order to make this place desirable and amenable to live. So in Springfield, the neighborhood I want to sort of focus on is down here in Forest Park Heights. It's on the border of the city. As you can see, Longmeadow, Massachusetts is just south of it, which is a very sort of affluent, suburban, low density, high housing costs town. Over here is East Longmeadow, very similar to Longmeadow. Over here is Agawam and West Springfield. Springfield is sort of ringed by these suburban, lower density, higher cost of living towns. And Forest Park is down here on the southern border. It contains an actual park that was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And then here's the historic district that I'll actually be discussing. So it's not the entire neighborhood. It's a very significant chunk of the neighborhood. So in Springfield, in Forest Park, in the early 1970s, as preservationists are sort of watching the city change around them, they're watching white people leave and go to Longmeadow, they're watching this uprising that's happening in the North End, not very far away from where they're living. They look around and ask themselves, how can preservation be fused together with the suburban politics of zoning that are so prevalent in places like Longmeadow to reinforce the kinds of economic and racial homogeneity in those suburbs? How can we make that happen here? In other words, how can we sort of import the technologies of exclusion that are specific to the suburbs? And how can we import those back into the city and make the city a desirable place for scared white folks to live? So preservationists quickly realized they can fuse these suburban politics with preservation to ensure that investments in private property remain stable. So how does this work? What do I mean when I say this? So in Forest Park, preservationists instrumentalize the neighborhood's history of exclusion in the 19th century as a seemingly non-ideological tool to justify exclusion in the 1970s. So Forest Park, the neighborhood, has a genuine history of exclusion. I mentioned the park itself is created by Frederick Law Olmsted. It's a massive, some 700 acres city park, which is a very impressive amenity for the neighborhood. It's sort of financed and developed by a couple of different individuals in the late 19th century who utilized restrictive covenants to limit the kinds of decisions that could be made about what buildings could be built in the neighborhood. So they require a certain minimum cost for your home. It had to be built as a single family home. It had to be set back from the street a certain amount. These covenants didn't explicitly mention race, but the agreement between these developers was that some poor industrial, maybe non-white worker in Springfield was not going to be able to afford an $8,000 house in Forest Park that they have to build as a single family massive home. And so you can see here in this little postcard snippet I have that the predominant sort of styles are these sort of colonial revival, Queen Anne, and this black and white photos from the early 1970s. So you can see how set back the houses are. It's got this very bucolic, it's semi-suburban, everything's very low density. People that come in from Longmeadow have a hard time distinguishing between the borders of Forest Park and Longmeadow because of the area's housing. So it's already got that going for it. So by the time the neighborhood is sort of fully developed, by 1920, these restrictive covenants have worked. The neighborhood has about 15,000 residents in it. Of those residents in 1920, only 25 of them were not white. And this remains the status quo in the neighborhood through the 1990s. It remains almost 100% white. But the surrounding city of Springfield does not. By the 1960s, the city starts to lose its white population. The city witnesses massive urban renewal clearance that starts to give the perception that Forest Park could be threatened by the kinds of demographic changes that are going on in the city. So by the 1960s and 1963, the residents of Forest Park mobilized their own civic association, which you can see editorialized in this cartoon here, the Forest Park Civic Association. And they organized to bring in these suburban politics of zoning into their more urban neighborhood. So they immediately organize against the erection of apartment houses, motels, and other buildings that they claim will adversely affect land values and lead to this general deterioration of property in the area. And any change in the character of a single lot threatens the neighborhood. And the Civic Association has this investment of tears and anguish and concern, and they're going to protect it, right? So we see this sort of seemingly race neutral language about zoning operating here, when the sort of unspoken assumption going on is that to allow apartment houses, motels, and these other buildings would make the neighborhood more accessible to non-white, non-middle class, not affluent folks, and that they see this as a bad thing. And I do love this editorialized cartoon. They're guarding Sumner Avenue, which is the sort of main thoroughfare in the neighborhood. And this is made to kind of mock them by the city's newspaper. And they actually take this cartoon and use it in their own self-promotion. Like they think this is great when this cartoon hits the papers. The other thing I want to emphasize is that these folks were not racist arch conservatives, like they were not Ku Klux Klan members. They identified as colorblind liberals, but this language of zoning and land use was just so incredibly powerful and swaying to them that they used it so frequently to articulate these what were inevitably exclusive and race-based exclusive goals. So what on earth does preservation have to do with any of this? So the Civic Association believed that historic preservation design regulations could cement the neighborhood's low density zoning and keep property values stable to ensure that the white folks who had bought houses in the neighborhood would keep their investment. Their investment would remain stable, their property values wouldn't go down. In fact, they hoped that the property values would go up by making the neighborhood a historic district. And the city of Springfield has its own local historic district ordinance. So districts can be listed locally or also on the National Register of Historic Places. The Civic Association decides to pursue both a local district and a National Register district. So immediately, the group starts to mobilize the neighborhood's history of exclusion and affluence to extend this agenda of low density zoning. So in this historic district campaign, they go around to their neighbors with petitions and argue that historic district status would help maintain the status quo in the neighborhood by stabilizing property values, warding off proposed higher density zoning changes that would be incompatible with the neighborhood's historic housing stock. And they emphasize that the neighborhood's history of exclusion and affluence justified these actions, that the neighborhood has always been a neighborhood of single family homes of white, affluent, middle class folks. Therefore, it should follow that that should be the same moving into the 1970s, moving into the 1980s, and these design regulations can help us maintain that. So ultimately, this narrative is kind of, this argument is sort of ensconced in the final historic district ordinance, which provided for a series of design regulations that regulated any major additions, changes to roof lines, changes to siding material, changes to windows, all these changes that the Civic Association thought that if buildings could be subject to those changes, that it'd be easier to convert a single family home into higher density housing. And I should note that they are incredibly successful in this endeavor. They get the historic district passed in 1975 with this argument about maintaining the status quo, maintaining this low density zoning, ensuring that white folks aren't leaving the neighborhood and that the property values aren't going down. And that's not just a hypothetical argument they make, they sort of put this into practice. So you can see here the original boundary for the historic district and this like weird sort of gerrymandered bit up here with the hatched shading. Those two streets preservationists start worrying are being converted into apartments and that white folks are leaving. And so in 79, they successfully get the historic district amended to include those two streets. The other thing that they do is any empty lots in the neighborhood that fall within the historic district, they manage to get other single family houses from elsewhere in Springfield moved onto those lots in order to ward off any higher density housing or business construction or commercial construction. And in fact, the preservationists often used national historic tax credits in order to do this, to finance the construction and removal of these single family homes from elsewhere in Springfield. And the Park Service fully signed off on these. They wrote in their applications that the neighborhood is this neighborhood of sort of affluent, tasteful single family homes. Therefore, moving this very random single family house from a totally different neighborhood is actually appropriate because it fits with the neighborhood's aesthetic and design and all that good stuff. And so there's a bunch of single family houses that are moved in where developers had plans originally to build higher density housing, more affordable housing, and preservationists kind of literally swoop in with these houses that they sort of throw down onto these empty lots. And this is one that's pictured here that sort of made the move across Springfield and into Forest Park. So what does this mean? Like, why does any of this matter? Like, what does this suggest about preservation? So ultimately, I would argue that what this case illustrates is that preservationists played this really important role in sort of re-inscribing or retrenching segregation in US cities. And this isn't just about like the segregation between cities and suburbs. This is the kinds of hyper segregation that goes on inside city boundaries, where some neighborhoods are incredibly affluent and others are have experienced so much divestment. Preservationists played a part in that by fusing this sort of racialized zoning practice with preservation to protect these investments in property. And I would also say, like, as a total disclaimer, again, these people were not like putting on the Klan robes and like making these arguments in bad faith. They like were genuinely concerned about their neighborhood. Often they were making these arguments in good faith, and this was sort of an unintended consequence of this particular pathway to that. The other thing I'd argue is we see here the sort of roots of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard-ism, which is this sort of political orientation that tries to deflect higher density developments or developments that people see as undesirable. Often things like affordable housing are sort of mobilized against in neighborhoods that have not really had affordable housing or not really had higher density housing. And we see this everywhere in the news. And there was a huge uproar most recently about California kind of getting rid of single family zoning and allowing homes and other places to be rezoned into higher density housing. So the question I want to sort of chew on for the remaining time is, I've presented what I think is not a desirable result from the preservation movement. So how could we sort of remedy this kind of exclusionary reality? And if we think about the ways in which the Forest Park Civic Association mobilized their neighborhood's history for this more exclusionary end, the inverse could also be true. That in a place like Forest Park, they were never just affluent white people. The neighborhood was never isolated from the surrounding city. It was a site of exclusion, but certainly was connected to the broader city through things like domestic labor. Those single family houses were not occupied by a single family. There were a cadre of domestic workers that were maintaining those kinds of places. And I'm not trying to make an argument that we should mobilize history to bring back the 19th century structure of domestic work, because that was also very problematic. But what I am trying to suggest is that we can think through the ways that these exclusionary realities of the past were a bit more complicated and a bit more complex. And we can think about how, when we mobilize history, we should be trying to mobilize something that's a bit more nuanced and complicated and is attending to the sort of messy realities. And so this history could be instrumentalized to advocate for creating this more inclusive sense of community. And the fact that these houses were never just occupied by one single family would suggest like it might not be the end of the world to like turn a single family house into a double family house and like maintain the sort of integrity of that structure. That would not be the end of the world. I know that's a kind of hot take for preservationists, but I think that's where I kind of want to leave it, is that we can think about the ways we can instrumentalize history for a more inclusive movement. And that's where I'll sort of stop with my particular piece. But I hope to answer any questions and generate lots of good discussion. And I hope it wasn't too much information just thrown out at everyone.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. If anybody has any questions or comments, just throw them in the chat there, and I'm more than happy to read them off for you, for Brian to answer, or if you just want to engage in a conversation and talk about what Brian has talked about and some thoughts that you might have and kind of expand on that, more than happy to do that as well. So, one of the things you discussed, I was making my notes here. When I first started out, I kind of gave this rambling intro about the preservation movement changing and how it evolves every year, and why we're excited to have Brian here, because even though the 1960s, 70s, and even the 80s is really not that long ago, and there's probably people on here that were involved with the preservation movement at that time, it's far enough away where we can reflect on it and see like, okay, we did these things in good intentions, and maybe there wasn't an outcome that was so great, and so we can reflect back and see what we did and really work towards that and making preservation a better, more involved, more inclusive movement in the future. And so that's why I really appreciate the research that you've been doing on this really recent past in historic preservation, and kind of weeding and uncovering the things that have worked and the things that haven't worked, and how we can improve on that. So thank you. So have you seen any successful examples of in any, across Massachusetts or anything in other communities that have been successful in, maintaining the demographic of a neighborhood or a community, so it's not excluding people or pushing people out due to historic preservation?
So there's I think a great example in New York, where a sort of permanent, they call themselves a permanent supportive housing provider. They're known as Breaking Ground. And in the early 90s, they undertake this project to renovate the Times Square Hotel, which had been a sort of single room occupancy hotel, which was a place where people who often don't have homes or don't have stable homes are able to kind of get a room to stay in pretty inexpensively, and it's pretty accessible. And we know Manhattan, Times Square is not the cheapest place to live. So this group very successfully redid this, or renovated this hotel, this giant hotel, into affordable housing for people, and continues to operate it to this day like that. And that's kind of tied up in this development that happens later in the 80s, where I think sort of at the tail end of the Reagan administration, we get the introduction of the low-income tax credit, which has become, I think, a really important tool for preservationists. to kind of pair with the historic tax credit to try and shift preservation away from just providing like luxury condos and lofts downtown to how can we actually be like guaranteeing that more people have a chance to live in housing they can afford that's also dignified and in a community that they want to live in and be a part of. I have my own thoughts about, like, I'm a bit opposed ideologically to the existence of tax credits, but I think that they're still really important tools, and the kinds of pairings of low-income tax credits and preservation tax credits that goes on, I think makes it more feasible for preservationists to work to provide more inclusive housing.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And I've been working in the historic preservation field for 15 years now. And, I've seen those things as well. It's just like you have a building that's, it has a affordable rent, where folks can live. And a lot of times this will get bought out and be turned into, high-end apartments. And so basically you're displacing these people. And I've also seen the other end too, where we're talking about where you have these grand old houses that have been split up into apartments, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which creates an affordable rent. And then those get wiped out and then some sort of new structure is put there. And, and talking about low-income tax credits, that can be used for historic structures. It can also be used for new structures that are coming in. So yeah, I kind of have the same feeling. It's trying to achieve a balance, so you're not forcing folks out, but still, I think there's a long way to go on that. So we have some questions. One of our board members, Frank Ordia, his first question is, have you seen examples of this in other cities in Massachusetts? And I'm not sure if that's what I touched on or kind of looking at the history of the neighborhood you talked about.
In both cases, yes. So there's a lot of similar things going on in places in Boston in particular, where certain neighborhoods, especially the South End in the 70s, which is just sort of southwest of downtown Boston and south of the Back Bay, if anyone is familiar with the geography of Boston. But in the 70s, there's a sort of similar initiative in the South End to make that a very affluent and sort of exclusive neighborhood that's very amenable to the sort of tastes of middle-class white consumers. And the South End remains today this sort of what we would call an example of gentrification, that some folks were sort of pushed out. The primary difference with the South End is that there were actually non-white folks that had been living in the neighborhood, whereas for most of Forest Park's existence, that wasn't the case. So there's an example of that going on in Boston, most definitely. And then in terms of other places, I can't speak so much to preservation, but there's certainly this sense in cities across the United States, especially the ones that aren't able to annex, like Omaha or Lincoln, or like places in California, like Los Angeles, that has these like sprawling city limits. In towns in the Northeast, there's this sense of how do we make the city attractive to white middle-class people, because that's the sort of tax revenue that city administrators are most interested in capturing. Mm-hmm. And that all raises questions about, like, well, who should cities be for? Like, who should the white middle-class consumer be the only like person or group of people that were like making cities most easy to live in for, when there's a whole other slew of diverse folks that are living in cities and need cities and work in cities. And yeah, I'm starting to just kind of ramble. So that's kind of where I'll
ramble away. That's good. No, it's great. Another question from Frank. He says, what's the nature of Springfield now? Are whites moving away from the suburbs back into the city?
So that's happened to a degree, but by the 90s, early 2000s, the city continues to sort of hemorrhage its population. And part of that is it has a really very traumatic process of deindustrialization, where the city loses a bunch of industries to offshoring. And then the city starts to go into receivership because they can't pay the bills to keep the lights on. So by the early 2000s, the city is in very bad financial straits. And white and Black and Puerto Rican folks kind of leave Springfield. Like, it's not seen as this very attractive place to live in the early 2000s. Some white folks had sort of moved back to the city, and that was a major goal of the preservation movement in Springfield, was to get white suburbanites, kind of lure them back into buying a home in the inner city and making it big in the inner city with these cheap housing prices and things like that. But the perception here in Western Mass broadly still exists that like Springfield is dangerous and it's not a good place to live, and that like you'd be better off in a place like East Longmeadow or Wilbraham instead of living in Springfield. And now the city's pursued this very aggressive redevelopment campaign. They managed to get MGM to build a new casino in town, which they're hoping is going to be this sort of, like, they're kind of turning the city into this playground for out-of-towners to come into on the weekend, gamble and drink, and then turn right back around and leave. And I think there's been this sense of giving up on trying to get people to live in Springfield permanently, but how can we like generate revenue for the city without getting people to live there? As I think,
kind of like a silver bullet idea. You know, it's like, what's this giant thing we can bring in? Because I've seen that in a couple of different cities I've lived in that have experienced white flight and loss of population over the years. And it seems like they're always trying to generate this idea of like, what's the big thing we can bring in to like keep this tax revenue here, instead of thinking more grassroots and broadly about how to retain citizens in the area. So we got another question in here. Question for Brian. In Massachusetts, zoning and preservation are considered by officials to be two separate tools of local government. The idea being that zoning governs use while preservation does not. How do you think this perspective applies to your research? Do you think this perspective is a useful one when looking at preservation in Massachusetts in the modern context?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think from what I've seen, I wouldn't say the distinction between zoning and preservation is arbitrary, but I would say that the line is a bit more permeable between the two. And so the example I think of is that the sort of historical commissions that are housed, that sort of oversee local historic districts in the state of Massachusetts are often housed in local planning departments that are also overseeing the more specific, like residence A single family zoning and commercial B, like commercials, like it's often the same staff people that are doing both of those jobs, especially in a city like Springfield that doesn't have a huge planning department and people kind of wear multiple hats. They're both the preservation planner and the zoning official in the same breath. So I think that kind of speaks to how these things are somewhat permeable. And preservationists think like zoners in that they think about the way a building has been used and whether the way in which it's going to be used remains appropriate with its sort of historical use. And so I think we see that kind of zoning logic, like working in a place like Forest Park, where people are really concerned about the houses remaining single family houses because they've always been single family houses and they can't be like used, like that's their most appropriate and best use for them, right? So I think that's kind of how I would answer that question, is that it's not totally arbitrary between the two, but I think they're more intertwined than we may give them credit for.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions, comments from anybody out there? I'll give you a few more minutes to think about it. Yeah, and thinking about Lincoln in particular, the near south neighborhood, because that's filled with a lot of grand old houses. And it is in a historic district, and off the top of my head, I believe it's also a local historic district. But I think a reason a lot of those houses still exist is because they were split up into apartments. They're multi-family units now, 2, 3, 4. Because it's kind of hard having a house that big to make it a single family house for one use for one person to live in. And so, I think there is a good argument for why maintaining these houses as multifamily houses, to keep them standing, to keep them used, to keep them intact as well, and to make affordable housing for all sorts of folks to be able to live there as well.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to like how we, again, this is like another very broad question, but it's like, how do we define, like, what do we mean when we say like preservationist? Like, who is a preservationist? Like, is it doesn't have to be someone that holds a degree from an accredited like preservation program. Like, if we, I think, reframe the way we think about like the multifamily tenants, like they are the ones that are like actually on the ground, like doing the physical maintenance and like taking care of those properties. And like, sure, there's probably like a building manager that like when the pipe bursts, they're coming in and doing that. But like, who's sweeping the floor and washing the windows and making sure the toilet isn't clogged and like doing all that sort of like day-to-day things to just like keep a property like functioning and working. Like they are preserving that building by like doing those things. They're making it habitable and useful for them. And that, I think, that sounds like preservation to me, right? Like it's, so I think that would also be a helpful way of like reframing the way we think about who is a preservationist.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about preservation, talking about what properties and buildings are important to that community. Because, we can come in as the feds or the state and say, okay, this building's important, but, maybe the community has a different aspect on what buildings are important. They may not be the grand houses or the grand buildings that we see. It could be, the neighborhood general store that has had significant changes. But that's an important building to the community and their history. And as another way to look at preservation, how to reframe it.
Yes.
Anybody else out there want to ask a question? Don't be shy. Well, if nobody else is going to ask another question, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. So everybody that attended, thank you so much for registering and attending and listening today. Thank you so much to Brian for taking the time out of his busy schedule while writing his dissertation to come speak to us today about one chapter of his dissertation. So thank you very much, Brian. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciated the opportunity and it was lots of fun. And thank you everyone to all the excellent questions that were asked.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And this will be posted on our website in the very near future. So keep a lookout there. We'll be sharing it on all of our social media. So thank you once again.